everybody for joining us today. Here on the East Coast, we're having a little bit of bad weather, so I was really hoping that the power wouldn't go out and we'd end up sitting here in the dark. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But my name is Maggie Melnick. I'm a managing partner here at Blend 360. And today's topic is preparing for the future of work today. We'll basically be talking about what everybody has been talking about, which are some of the current talent trends, the future of jobs. Many of us are talking about the war for talent, the great resignation, or the turnover tsunami, depending on what you're calling it these days. Certainly we'll cover the impact of the fourth industrial revolution and, of course, the global pandemic impacts. We'll touch on the gig economy, and hopefully you'll walk away with some thoughts on how to navigate the supply and demand of talent today, not just for 2021, but for next year and beyond. So whether you're leading a team, building a team, or a member of a team, I think you'll walk away with some interesting insights from our terrific panel today. So let me just kick it off by introducing the panel that's on with me today. Jenna Carlson recently joined Blend 360 as our talent acquisition lead. She has over 10 years of experience in HR recruiting and talent acquisition. So we'll be looking forward to her thoughts on what's happening in this talent market. Certainly responsible for hiring thousands of people across the country and globally in analytics, technology, media, and creative. And so we're really happy to have Jenna on the panel as well as part of the Blend family. Also on the panel today is Kirti Naik, a marketing leader with over 20 years of experience across a number of different industries, most notably financial services. She's currently head of marketing at BNY Mellon and serves on a number of nonprofits, including the Directors for Financial Communications Society and Fly a Kite Foundation, and has an MBA from Columbia Business School. So thank you, Kirti, for joining us today. Unfortunately, Renee Baker is sick today. It's unfortunate she's not going to be able to join our panel. We're hoping that Renee can be on a future panel. We're all disappointed that she won't be here today, but hopefully we'll have Renee back at another time. And then last but not least is Jeff Wald, a founder of Work Market, an enterprise software platform that many companies are using to manage their freelancers. And that platform was purchased by ADP. He's founded a number of other companies, including Spinback, and also an angel investor and startup advisor. And we'll be talking about his book, The End of Jobs, throughout our conversation today. Certainly an interesting take on a number of things that we've been seeing in the talent market, as well as what we're seeing today post-pandemic. So I'm really excited to have you all here. Thank you for being on the panel. And why don't we jump into it and just start to talk a little bit about what we're seeing right now. Obviously, a lot has happened in the workforce over the last 18 months, which has created both opportunities and challenges. So Jeff, why don't we kind of start with you and maybe you can share some of your observations.
Sure. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. Very excited for the conversation. Maggie, when I think about the history of work, and that was the focus of my book, was to look at history, to look at data, to look at how companies actually engage workers, and to use that lens of evidence to make thoughtful predictions about the future. I think we can describe the history of work all the way up until today as this undulating power balance between companies and workers. And traditionally, companies have the majority of that power, and workers are disadvantaged. And what we saw as we kind of came into the pandemic was a big fear around the fourth industrial revolution. And these industrial revolutions we'll talk about are generally huge increases in technological capabilities that massively decrease the potential need for workers because they increase productivity so much. And because there's that increase in productivity, there's the fear that that supply and demand balance, which is already imbalanced for workers, is going to get all the more acute because these new technologies will mean fewer workers are needed. And every time we always see everyone freak out and go, oh my God, the jobs are going to be gone and society's going to fall. And obviously it has never happened. And we have three almost uninterrupted trends in the history of work. The history of work goes about 200 years, where we think about a job in the context of working for somebody else. Those three almost uninterrupted trends are humans working fewer hours, people having a higher standard of living, and there being more jobs. Over 200 years, almost uninterrupted trends. And so as we came into the beginning of the pandemic, we had this general fear of a new supply and demand imbalance with the fourth industrial revolution. But clearly the pandemic fundamentally altered a lot of things. And I know we're going to talk a lot about that today. But what happened in that 18-month period is you went from having this fear of, oh my gosh, there aren't going to be enough jobs, to a collapse in demand in kind of Q2 of 2020. And then a massive rebound in demand because of the pandemic not altering as much behavior as we thought, because of mostly government spending and stimulus measures. And normally supply and demand will kind of move pretty quickly to get back into balance. And we saw a massive decrease in supply that came along with the massive decrease in demand, but we have not seen the supply increase again. And the big reasons for that are a continued fear of COVID. People still are not running back to their workplaces, not running back to employment. Immigration, which normally grows the labor pool, and retirement. People like to point to, oh, the people have so much money because of stimulus checks and things like that. There's no data to support that. That is not what is driving the majority of it. There is minor impacts of that. So you still have this supply and demand imbalance, but right now it is a huge imbalance the other way, where there is an acute shortage of workers, and that is the big story from a macro standpoint over the last 18 months.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, right? Because even just reading through your book, Jeff, you know, a lot of these things are not surprising, but you talk about, you know, economic shocks and social impacts and how that can accelerate some of the trends that we're seeing. And clearly over the last 18 months, we've seen that, right? We've absolutely seen that.
It's very true. When you historically look at big changes that occur in the labor force, they generally occur because of some external event, some exogenous event, whether it's a war, whether it's a depression or Great Recession. Outside of those things, the labor markets move pretty slow and pretty steadily and pretty predictably. Anytime you hear somebody, this is one of the major conclusions of the book, say, oh, in the next 5 years, this is going to grow by 50% or 100% in the labor force, it almost never happens, except when you have these types of events. And we are clearly, God willing, at the tail end of one of these events, but we clearly went through one of those events that has caused a fundamental shift in the labor force, a lot of which we'll discuss today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jenna, I know from your perspective, being, you know, front and center, right, in the talent acquisition space, I know that you're seeing this firsthand.
Yeah, so again, Maggie, thank you for allowing me to participate in this. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, there's a huge gap in terms of supply and demand when it comes to marketing talent. I think to Jeff's point too, you know, the three causes of that. The one thing that he didn't mention too is childcare is causing a huge shortage. There's so many women that are leaving the workforce now because of the childcare shortage. Me being a working mom of 3 kids, I've experienced it myself. Luckily, I haven't had to leave the workforce, but I know many people have had to make that really difficult decision to leave the workforce because they don't have the childcare that they need. So I've seen that impact the supply of talent specific to marketing talent that I am going after. I've also seen a huge shift in early careers talent as well. I feel like the younger generation, they are much more likely to hop around from organization to organization. And coming from Merkle and Dentsu over the last 10 years, and now joining Blend in the last couple months, it's like just so commonplace to have those big holding companies almost share a workforce. As the demand moves from agency to agency, the supply moves with it, which is interesting. But early careers talent in particular, I think, COVID forced them to think differently about what's important to them. And work-life balance has been something that we've talked about for a long, long time, but they're flipping it now. They're flipping it on its head to be life-work balance. They want work to fit into their life. They want flexibility of where they work. They want flexibility in how they work. They want flexibility in what they're working on and why they're working on it. And I think the what and the why, it's very critical for that early careers talent, especially. They want to work for companies that are meaningful to them, on work that is very meaningful to them. It's so important when I talk to candidates that are early in their career. That is what is most important to them, is meaningful work with clients that they admire, and for companies that they admire as well. But overall, in the marketing space, it's and specific to the professional services consultancy area, we're highly COVID sensitive, just like the other services industry is, like Ubers or food service workers. It's just they are desiring more flexibility. They are desiring the work and the life to be more blended, if you will. They don't want to be judged on how many hours they're working. They want to be evaluated based on their productivity, period. So yeah. That's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in general, an event like this, right, a scenario like we've experienced over the last, year and a half, causes people to take a step back, right, and reevaluate their life a little bit, right? Maybe take stock in what they're doing and why they're doing it. And maybe they've experienced something traumatic or, something kind of life altering that's making them consider that. But on a positive note, it also gives people the chance to live where they want to live, right? And have a little bit more free time because they're not spending hours commuting to an office in a big city every day, right? So there's some other things that are coming out of this scenario that I think are changing the way people think about their jobs. And Kirti, I'm sure you're seeing this firsthand, right? From a leader perspective, right? You're leading and building a team during this time, and I'm sure you're experiencing that.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything that Jeff and Jenna articulated, I have to say I can't argue because I'm seeing a lot of those similar trends. I'm just for a moment though gonna switch gears a little bit to share like just my personal kind of career story. And I think that's important for people who have positions like myself, right? We have to remember where we were, how we got here, and how the different environmental factors that kind of surround us today is very different from 10 or 20 years ago, when we started our career. And Maggie, thank you for aging me. Yes, 22 years, been doing this as a marketer. And it is amazing to me how much has changed, right? I remember it was all about being in the office and FaceTime. And if you're there, that means you're actually working. And if you're there late, that means you're like a superstar who's working late, right? And that is not exactly how we look at things today. In fact, I've been very blessed with really amazing managers and leaders who I've reported into over the course of my career, where it was not about how many hours I was logging or how long I was seen. It was about my output. It was about what I was doing to drive the company forward. It was about me interacting and having a community of colleagues in which I congregated with. It was about all those other elements. And it's so interesting, Jenna, some of the things that you pointed out, those things are starting to become like tried and true in a way for kind of new generation of career finders, I'll call them. And it's not about like, let me just come in and get a paycheck. It's about getting a paycheck, working in the right environment that allows me to still live my life. And that's been real challenge for me working in financial services, because it is a lot more antiquated from that standpoint. There's this high expectancy of, you must be wearing your nice suit, you must be sitting at your desk, you must be sitting in that conference room. It's like all about that FaceTime that still matters. And it was so crazy, Maggie, for me to join BNY Mellon Wealth during a pandemic, right?
Right.
I interviewed virtually, I got onboarded virtually, and then I was gifted this amazing team who, by the way, I've only still met in person, face to face, 6 people, I think, out of my whole organization, even today. And it's nuts because, we had to figure out how to pivot a whole company and do it, virtually and digitally, and one that really is dependent on face to face. And so it became really critical when I joined that I helped nurture these relationships. It was important that we found ways to congregate and come together still, even if it was in a virtual format. And then as far as like also creating new roles and onboarding these roles, we just brought in 8 new people into my organization. And that was really interesting from the supply and demand side, Jeff, of what you were saying, because I'll tell you, the right supply was not out there for my demand. And thank goodness, we are, I think, all marketers in this specific grouping here. And so we tend to be more social. We tend to network. We have that kind of innate qualities. Thank God, because it was really our network between my team and myself that we found all the right people to fill our roles. But I will tell you, my other colleagues out there are struggling to find the right talent, the right background, and also the right motivation, right? That was the other thing. And I don't think any of you mentioned their value that in which they value themselves at. I have to say, I wish I had some of that boldness when I was, in my 30s, and say, well, no, I'm valued at 100% more than that. And that's all I'm going to accept, or I'm going to push back on that offer, because that's the offer I want. And that's been a huge eye opener for me. It's like, we'll go through the process, and if the dollar signs aren't right, even though all maybe other elements of it they like, we lose them. So I think there's a lot more transparency today into what your value and worth is when you're also going and pursuing that new opportunity at a company. And as a hiring manager, you have to be cognizant of that and aware. And that means we need to build the right business case internally, right? To ensure that we are kind of putting out a requisite that is aligned with what the market wants and what, the kind of future career finders are seeking.
Yeah, Kirti, to that point too, the value in what they're wanting, and also the speed at which they want to move around. So if as an employer and as a hiring manager, if your process from when you put a requisition out there to when you're able to make an offer, if that is not really, really fast, you're going to lose out on the best talent, because there's just so many competing offers and companies that are interested in this talent. It's fascinating to me. I don't know where all this demand is coming from. I wish I could figure that out.
Well, I do think that technology companies have changed the landscape in the last decade, right? The number of people that I met that have worked at cool companies like Twitter or Google and all these places, even if it wasn't about pay being commensurate with it, it was about lifestyle. It was about, access. It was about the unlimited vacations. And it was, all these other elements that made the opportunity more interesting for them. And working in a very regulated, structured, and highly guardrailed environment like financial services, we are, I think, slowly starting to catch up. And I think the pandemic accelerated our ability to do that. As much as the pandemic has been horrible, right, for all reasons that I don't need to mention. And I personally had a loss in my family too. As a result of it, I also look at it as what it's done to truly move our industry forward. There are things that I would be battling from a digital standpoint, or why I need that digital marketing talent, or why I need this. A year or 2 years ago, that would have been like pulling teeth. But in this scenario, it was, that's valid. We do need to think about that, because the client experience ultimately needs to be balanced between digital and traditional formats. So marketing has to be equipped as a result.
Yeah,
So-
you're absolutely right. Oh, sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
No problem. I mean, look, this is a problem right now, but I do want to emphasize it may not be a problem in 9 months, right? Like you're talking about acute labor shortages that are usually temporal. They either education systems catch up, supply increases either from immigration or because we start to look for a more global workforce. What's interesting is that you will also see demand start to tail off as you have the expiry of a host of different pandemic related packages that will decrease demand, not only from the consumer side, but from the company side. And the last interesting trend, by the way, to note is a lot of Kirti, what you're talking about, and Jenna, in terms of that tech talent, so much of it right now is being utilized by loss-making enterprises, which normally can't exist for a period of time, except when you have a super cycle of venture capital investing, which we saw obviously in 99 and 2000, and a huge amount of employment went that way. Those companies eventually either they make a profit or they die. There is not a limitless appetite for VCs to continue to back loss-making enterprises, but right now there is. And so whether or not that is a structural change where we have so much capital flowing there, I would be shocked if it were, but right now it is adding to the demand side and pulling a lot of supply away. I would anticipate a lot of this modulating over the next 6 to 9 months.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk more about predictions. But you're absolutely right, Jeff. I think what we're seeing right now, it came on suddenly and it'll likely last for several months. But, the VC element of it, it's creating sort of those kind of hot and sexy jobs, right? That people are interested in looking for, especially if they've got an entrepreneurial sort of spirit, right? And if you're not worried about being somewhere for 20, 30 years, then maybe you're not all that concerned about it being a 2-year sprint, right? And so it's kind of interesting. I think it would be great, Grace, if we poll the audience a little bit too, just to see what some of the organizations out there, their biggest challenges are. So if everybody in the audience can take a moment to answer kind of the first poll here, what's your organization's biggest talent challenge right now? First one is attrition and resignations. We've touched on a little bit about the Great Resignation, skills gap in your current team, recruiting support, reskilling and training support. We've heard from a lot of organizations that are having trouble training their teams fast enough on some of the new technologies, attracting top talent, or some combination of all of the above. So if you could just take a moment to answer that, that would be great.
Bets? I'm going to bet on number 6. Putting all my chips on number 6.
All your chips on number 6.
Yeah, I was also clicking number 6, but then it's
And then did you realize that we're not allowed to vote as you went to try to go vote?
No, you're not allowed to vote. Sorry, panelists are not allowed to vote, nor is the host. So we're excluded from that.
Well, one thing I'll say that might be missing wise from here, Maggie, from my perspective, is also helping existing talent grow within the organization. It's sort of covered in the attrition piece, but beyond and retention. But to me, a big aspect of that is actually how do we create new opportunities in our organization for them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that is something that we need to touch on in terms of retention, right? Growing and investing in your current team and helping them to develop the skills needed for the future of your company or in the future of their careers is absolutely important. But yep, no surprise. It looks like more than half went for all of the above, not surprising at all. That's kind of where the results landed. I feel like every conversation we're having these days is touching on some element of all of these things. So we're talking about, things that we're seeing right now. But there are some things that we've been seeing for a while. Kirti, you even touched on it in terms of, 2 years ago, if you wanted to invest in a digital marketing initiative or people with certain types of specialized skills, that would have required probably many meetings and a business case and proving out the ROI, et cetera. Clearly some of the things that we're seeing now, and Jeff, you talked about this, have been coming for some time, right? It's just that it accelerated over the last 18 months. And Jeff, I know you touch on this in your book as well. The impacts of something so monumental as the pandemic and all the far-reaching impacts into the workforce. There's a lot of debate about when this actually started. Did it start with the pandemic, or did it start, years ago?
Well, certainly when we think about the evolution of the workforce, and the reason I called the book The End of Jobs is not because I believe that jobs will collapse. Again, almost uninterrupted trend over the last 200 years, more and more jobs in society. It is because the job as we knew it over the last 30 to 40 years, this one office, one manager, 9-to-5 job, that job is dying. And the death of that job happened well before the pandemic, but the pandemic massively accelerated its death. And its death gets manifested in 3 broad trends. One is remote work. We'll double click on that in a second. The second is on-demand labor. And the third is this general fourth industrial revolution, robots and AI. So on the first, remote work had grown 100% from 2010 to 2020, from 1.5% of the labor force to 3% of the labor force. And remote work has a very specific definition. It means more than 50% of the time you're not going into an office. And we can track remote work because it's a tax nexus issue. So our friends at ADP know exactly who's a remote worker because they know where your tax nexus is. Flexible work, we don't really track, meaning if you go to the office 3 days a week, I don't know who you are because your tax nexus is the office. If you go 2 days a week, I know exactly who you are. So 1.5% to 3% of the labor force, when we look at the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, 40% of the US workforce was working remotely. Only 42% of the workforce can work remotely, right? That's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that people obviously in manufacturing and transportation and logistics and a lot of retail operations and a host of services can't work remotely. So it's always important to remember that when we talk about our segment of the labor force, we're talking about a subsegment of a subsegment. And the trends of the labor force as a whole are very different. But remote work post-pandemic, all the data and research that we see at the ADP Research Institute and at various other places would tell us about 8% of the US workforce will work remotely. Remembering remote has that very specific definition. And upwards of 33% will work either remote or flexible, where they're going to the office 2-3 times a week, or 3 weeks out of the month, and a month they're working from home. That flexible work arrangement will become the byword for the workforce going forward. On-demand labor, people like to think it got invented with Uber. On-demand labor has been around for generations. It has been about 25% of the labor force for a very long time, growing slowly and steadily. There are a lot of predictions out there like, oh my God, 50% of the labor force is going to be on demand by 2028. No, it's ridiculous. When I started Work Market in 2010, the prediction was by 2020, 50% of the labor force will be on demand. Now, look, I took that and I put it into my investment deck because I had to raise $100 million to build Work Market. So I used it, but I knew it was bullshit. It was not true then. It is not true now. That is not going to happen. ADP, using Work Market data and ADP data, was able to show a 3% market share gain from 2010 to 2020. So about 25% to about 28%. That slow and steady growth will continue to be the hallmark. With this one, though, we don't really know how the pandemic's impacted it. For those of us that spend their free time, sadly, studying labor statistics, there's just too much noise in the statistics right now. We don't have a good sense, and on-demand labor, much like flexible work, is very difficult to track. But our general sense is it may have accelerated that trend, but not in any unbelievably great way. So maybe instead of 0.3% a year of market share gain, it might get to 0.4,
right?
Something along those lines. And then robots and AI, this trend of automation and different technologies massively increasing productivity has been around since the first industrial revolution. But what is different this time, and this was certainly a point, Kirti, you brought up with It used to be, FaceTime is what helped people have productivity, not in a factory, right? In a factory, it was very clear what determined productivity. All of those types of tools are coming to the office, are coming to service industries. And so it will decrease the amount of FaceTime, but it will increase the amount of optics into productivity that people have. And all of those things will layer on top of other things that remove repetitive high volume tasks that continue to remove people from the workforce. But the end of the story is that robots and AI will lead to no net job losses in the economy over the next 20 years. There will be tremendous dips in certain types of employment, but there'll be increases in others. And we will talk a little bit later about reskilling and its importance as a labor force trend.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you touch on something interesting there, Jeff, about it creating more jobs. And one of the things that we're seeing here, and of course, at Blend, we focus on marketing and product, right? So those are the trends that we tend to pay a lot of attention to, but the specialization within those skills, right? And the analytical skills required that go along with that are now in much higher demand than 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so it's not that there's fewer jobs, but there's different jobs, right? Different jobs.
Very fair. Very fair. Look, one of the, I wouldn't call it a macro trend, but certainly a micro trend is something we call the atomization of work and breaking things down into their component tasks. It is an inherent part of the death of the 9-to-5, one office, one manager job, moving, by the way, into what we call the fluid, team-based, work from anywhere, always on job. That's kind of the new job in this context. And the atomization of work, and therefore the matching of skills to specific types of work, is certainly a powerful subcurrent there.
Yeah, for sure. I know for a lot of folks, right, they think of those things and they say, oh, my skills, right? I'm worried about my skills and whether I can keep up with these trends as, things are moving, and especially overnight, right? In a very short period of time, whether you were at a very small company or a large global multinational, there was a huge focus on digital transformation, regardless of how many meetings there had been over the last 10 years, right? Suddenly it was the top of the agenda for everyone. And I think that that's having a huge impact on the workforce today as well. So let's just talk a little bit about, how this is impacting marketing and product development. I know, Jenna, that this is something that you deal with every day. You touched on it a little bit earlier about how this, how this is impacting those two key spaces right now.
Yeah, so from a talent perspective, I'll look at it from like a skills and a talent perspective, Maggie. You touched on it already. Analytics is, the toughest job to fill, as is any type of like engineering, data engineering, business intelligence, visualization. They are the highest demand skills, yet, the supply of those skills is very low right now. And large in part, I think there's a shift. Education system needs to catch up with the types of skills that marketers are looking for specifically. And that's coming. We're seeing improvements there. But also where we look from a talent acquisition standpoint, primarily we would only look at folks that had either master's level, PhD level, some undergraduate levels. But we're shifting where we're looking to for those types of skill sets with the rise of all these coding boot camps. And I think, we're forced to do that because of the supply issue, but where we're looking has changed significantly. The buy, borrow, build, which, is a topic we can debate for a long time. We're also figuring out ways that we can build talent instead of constantly coming to buy the talent at a more experienced level, is bringing folks in from campus and building them to be exactly kind of the marketers and the data analysts, the data scientists that we need them to be to service our clients. So that is something that as an organization, it's a different mindset, and they need to be open to building talent as opposed to constantly buying talent. And then also project-based workers, gig workers. And I know, Jeff, you know a lot more about this area than I do, but we've seen a huge increase in the desire and the need to build project-based teams. If you bring a client into the organization and they have a specific project, we don't have the skills for that project, so we go and we borrow them for a short period of time and then give them back. So, or convert them to full-time. So they are things that as an organization, we're thinking about as talent acquisition professionals, understanding the strategy to find those individuals. And I think the organization that has the right mix of full-time employees with project-based flex talent is the organization that is going to be the most successful. It's just getting that balance right and having the right access to those workers, how to find them quickly.
Well, Jenna, you're a perfect straight man, because that is exactly the topic of our next poll for the audience. You know, we talk about this a lot here, and it'll be interesting to see how other organizations are addressing this, right? Are they looking at a build strategy? Are they looking at a buy strategy? Are they borrowing, right? I'm going to guess that Jeff's going to bet on D, some combination of all of these things or something entirely different. And so these are the things that, you know, we talk about here. It looks like we'll have a poll coming up for the audience. Grace, can you pull that up? So number 2, the poll on the bottom here is, what is your organization's primary strategy? A, build, B, buy, C, borrow, D, combination, or any other? And sorry for our panelists, but you cannot vote.
I can't vote. It's okay. It's okay. Look, I think the whole build context is super, super interesting. You know, you saw our friends at Adecco buy General Assembly, and this is something that a lot of people are thinking about. And how do we build the right infrastructure in order to build candidates? Because as you know, the global staffing firms are struggling with this, and their solution has been thus far to make very large acquisitions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it's fascinating just to watch how companies are bringing these things in-house, right? And making it part of their core talent strategy, right? It's not just a temporary fix.
And the benefits of doing that, Maggie, the benefits of bringing, you know, building talent from a culture perspective, from a retention perspective are huge.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is interesting. So the leading answer here is buy, hire permanent talent. And I think that's interesting. Any comments from our panelists on that?
I think this further confirms the, you know, not much ado about nothing, but that the on-demand labor force is a little overhyped as seen by the respondents. And I am, though, surprised that the combination answer doesn't always win.
Yeah, that would have been my bet for sure. Definitely. So great. So, go ahead.
I think the combination is frankly probably most accurate, though, from when I think about what I've been able to do and have to do, and just comparing notes with my other CMO friends and what we have to do. The reality is marketing, doesn't matter what industry or sector, we tend to be not seen as an investment, we're seen as a cost center. And for that reason, I think it is absolutely critical that we are always kind of proving our value. And if that means that you have to pivot the organization to support new initiatives, new strategies, in this case, the pandemic accelerating our digital capabilities, it was really important for us to actually reskill and upskill the existing talent, for instance, while kind of considering some temporary kind of project managers to come in and step in, or look at our internship program and look at how we can build some talent from there and potentially build a case to bring them on full time when they're done with their internship. So I feel like I personally have always employed a combination of those things versus leaning into one or the other. And I find that it also helps to kind of protect our entire P&L as a result, right? When you look at our general expenses, allows you to control your budget and be a lot more smarter and make every dollar work harder. So that was just going to be something I was going to add to all the smart comments made by Jenna and Jeff.
Yeah, no, that's great, Kirti. And actually you touched on something that would be good to dive into a little bit more in terms of, is that something that has changed for you over time? Or, having had a career in marketing, has this sort of always been your strategy in terms of how you think about building out an organization?
It has always been my strategy. My idea was to keep our general expenses low, which includes human capital, right? And so that we can actually build business cases to get dollars to invest and build a brand externally. If everything goes into building our resources internally, you really are left with having to prove a lot more from an ROI standpoint. So we have to be very, I call it surgical and strategic in how we kind of really composite our organization and what is it really aligning to and supporting, so that it's always driven and it's frankly there's the efficacy of it that we're always proving out, right? So is the ROI.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting too is a lot of companies are thinking of it as, what do I need today, and will that look different 6 months from now, 9 months from now, 12 months from now? And do I have a long-term plan for that particular person, skill, department, project? Or is this a temporary situation and I don't want to buy something permanent when I really need something temporary,
yeah,
right?
I mean, there's massive overhead that we incur when we open a whole new role within our organization. And it's not just about, hey, let me make sure they get the right salary. It comes down to discretionary bonus. It comes down to benefit. It comes down to the culture. It comes down to all these other things that we want to be able to do to make it a lovely working environment. And so you have to think about all of that. And where is the give and take in terms of, yes, it's wonderful to have, a 100-person marketing team, but what are you getting really out of it at the end of the day?
Yeah.
And I think also for me, I mean, personally, I found it very, I love mentoring talent. I've done it for years and years. I do it with external organizations within BNY, and then even with my own team. It's so important that I spend time to identify hidden talent, right? Because just because they're doing one thing doesn't mean they can't do something else that could ultimately align to something in the future. And so I just encourage other leaders, take time to learn all of the talent in your team, because you'll be surprised at what you can achieve with your existing body of folks.
Maggie,
Yeah.
if I could double click on this for a second, because Kirti's raising such an incredibly powerful point. As an angel investor, I get to see a lot of HR tech companies, and there are innumerable companies in kind of the TDA space, right? The talent acquisition and development space. And they struggle so much with getting traction at companies because companies aren't willing to spend the money. They know it's a problem. They know that they can put in, different AI technologies to help them bring better people. They know they can bring in all kinds of training and all kinds of LMS systems and things to help them develop their own talent or identify skill upgrades and a host of things, but they don't really do it. And so there's just this fascinating dynamic where everyone says, oh, our people are our most important thing, but we're not really willing to spend the time on the people. So we're just going to go hire a recruiter and pay them, which is great. And I think works very well. And they should all hire, great recruiters like, I don't know, Blend 360, maybe something like that. I don't know. But it's fascinating to me because the tech exists to do a lot of these things in a much more efficient way. But it takes time, it takes money and implementations, and people just no, I got to go to the next thing.
No,
and they shouldn't.
Jeff, because BNY has taken this very much as a concerted focus in the past year. And I've only been here a year and a half, and so much has changed from an HR recruiting and just employee engagement standpoint, because we really want to shift from sort of like that, oh, we just work 9 to 5 and we sort of get something done culture to performance-based culture, but one that's also really propelled by all these other facets of culture and whatnot. So they actually implemented a system called Pecan, and it has been eye-opening for me, in terms of, wow, I thought we had this conversation. I thought I understood where this part of my organization is or feels and whatnot, but because it's, an unbiased as well as like hidden kind of incognito response they can provide, people really open up, and you start identifying themes, and you start seeing folks who've been here for a tenure of 2 to 5 years. They definitely want to be motivated and taken advantage of to learn something new, versus the new folks that we just brought in are excited, and so on and so on. So having that type of data and access to insights is so important. And I think what's really cool about the Pecan is that it is frequent, as much as it's like sort of like an eye roll for a manager. We're like, oh, more feedback. But then at the end, but then at least it's like real time, right? Versus a giant yearly employee survey where you're then like trying to pinpoint, well, what was happening that quarter when they answered that? Because maybe that impacts some of their responses, right? And then you can't really actively address it. So I think there are really cool tools out there, Jeff. And it's, to your point, companies have to invest time and energy and effort in implementing them, but then getting people to utilize them, and then turn it into a tool for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a great lead in, Kirti, because one of the things we haven't spent a lot of time talking about today is just what does this mean for employees, right? Jeff touched on the power imbalance, right? And what we've been seeing over the last, say 6 to 10 months, in terms of what employees have now in terms of choice, right? What candidates have in terms of choice. The Great Resignation is not just about, it's not about people losing jobs, right? It's about people leaving jobs and in search of something else. And so, as we kind of look at how all of these trends are impacting companies and hiring leaders, it's also interesting just to take a little bit of a lens on how is it impacting employees, right? And what does it mean for employees? So Jeff, maybe you could start off here, and anyone else who wants to jump in.
So right now you have this acute labor shortage, which means the power balance is very shifted in certain industries, in certain job functions. That won't last. It's a question of how long it's going to persist, but it will stop at some point. So one of the things I find super interesting, just to build actually on another point that Kirti made, was one of the things that we identify in the book is something we call convergence. The convergence is on-demand workers and full-time employees starting to look like each other. And, I called the book The End of Jobs, The Rise of On-Demand Workers and Agile Corporations. And people thought, oh, does that mean you think all employees are going to be Uber drivers? No, that's ridiculous. It's never going to happen. But the tensions that the on-demand worker faces, data-driven HR, right? On the work market platform, which manages billions of dollars in spend of freelance workers, we're capturing 127 unique data points. So Kirti, to your point about feedback, there's not an annual review. There is a constant stream of data on how that person, that worker performs. We have personal responsibility, right? They are shifting away from the company safety net more to their own safety net. And that's got a huge history and series of implications. But, it used to be as a company or as a worker, I knew my company was going to train me and develop me. And now more of that falls on me. And what does that mean? And what's the opportunity set there? There is more task-based work. Again, that freelancer is a task-based worker, and we're seeing more of that. Maggie, to our point earlier on the atomization of work, of task-based work permeating full-time employment. And the freelancer faces an algorithm allocating the work based on the data, based on the task. We're increasingly seeing that as a full-time employee. So in terms of the trends for employees, you're starting to see this convergence, and that has a ton of implications. But the near-term trend is really around this acute labor shortage and how long it lasts. Because traditionally, the supply and demand imbalance will favor companies, and what helps workers are the social safety net, unions, and regulation. And so there are a lot of things that we can talk about within that. But I will yield the floor because I could go on for like an hour just on those three counterbalancing forces and how they've trended over time.
I was gonna say, I don't know about a union for marketers. That would be news for me.
Well, it's interesting because people always say, oh, well, the freelancers, will they organize? And I was giving a talk the other day and somebody said, well, how come freelancers don't organize? And I said, well, they're so different, right? An Uber driver and a marketing freelancer and all these other things. Yet the union movement in the United States has less than 7% of the labor force, but carries a tremendous amount of political weight.
Yeah.
Whereas the freelance workers in California, when they finally had the legislature pass a law that made them more likely to be classified as employees of Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and Postmates, the ballot initiative they got crushed in, Prop 22, where basically the question was, do you want workers to have the rights? I'm going to make a very glib interpretation, so my apologies. Do you want workers to have their rights and be treated like employees? Or do you want to wait another 3 minutes and pay $5 more for your Uber ride? And the people of California overwhelmingly said, I don't want to wait for an Uber. So you guys are freelancers. Let's go. I gotta go places.
Yeah.
So the power of freelancers in this to drive change is limited, but the power of regulation writ large and the union movement and how the union movement's evolving into like the fight for 15 are certainly very powerful trends helping the employees.
No, I do agree with that. I would say my at least exposure and experience is with marketing freelancers, right? And I feel like they feel a little empowered at the moment, I think, so that they can keep their options open. Given the quote great resignation of 2020 to 2021 that's occurring, I am actually surprised at how many freelancers though. And I'm speaking in terms of my exposure to ones that we might use or friends in the community. They're actually looking for full-time work. They kind of were like, oh, aren't you going to offer me a full-time job now? I've been freelancing for you the last year or two, and you bringing me into projects here and there. And so I'm seeing that shift. So there's a lot more empowerment there, and it's probably because there's opportunities. But from a flexible schedule standpoint, I think, the reality is we don't save lives for the most part in marketing. We're not medical workers. We're not moving that door onto like the car frame, like we're not doing we don't actually need to be physical, truly, if we don't need to be. And I do think that's certainly empowered our function, right? To say, I'm interested in this, but I want to be remote, and I want to be remote from anywhere. And you have to kind of go through the hiring process. I think the real solid review of like the recommendations and referrals and figure out like, am I going to trust this person to come on and actually probably be remote unless I bring people together on an offsite or something like that that's physical, and be sure that they're going to get their work done, right? And I think there's an element of trust that we have to provide and give and accept in this new kind of world of relationships that we're forming, and they're all being forged in a virtual format. My team, for instance, is on a flexible schedule. They can go in a couple days a week into the office if they'd like, and in some instances, if they're not near an office, they are fully remote. And what I have grown to learn in my short tenure here with my team is they are phenomenal. They have gotten work done above and beyond. If anything, I had to start thinking about them turning off their laptops, please, at a certain time, because it started becoming bad habit where we're all just on our computer constantly. Our home is turned into our office is our home. And I think that's going to be the new challenge as we go into 2022 is, even if we stay on like a flexible remote schedule, how do we create that partition between what's home and what's office? I think it's really important for mental health. And ensuring that people are motivated and excited and still want to get their work done. There are some companies, I'm not going to mention which public entities have done this, but in just the last few months, there are companies that have actually instituted Friday at noon. Their company closes every Friday moving forward because they found that their employees were working too long on the computer Monday through Thursday, that it was just like burnout, like complete mental burnout, right? So
Yeah.
they're like shutting their offices down starting at noon. And I want to see, Jeff, in your subsequent like insights and research as you continue to do what you do and your expertise, is that going to be a new trend? Because I know there are quite a few countries that will have like instituted like 4-day work weeks, or, you know, in certain sectors. Is that going to be the new place we go? Since I know I'm on the computer 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. And then Fridays are the only day I'm like 5 o'clock, please God, I need to be off.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I am curious how that's going to maybe be a new trend that's beneficial to employees.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it'll be interesting to see, because I think for some people, working remote has always been part of their career, and they over time have figured out how to put those boundaries up and where to draw the lines. But for an entire workforce, this is new, right? And they are still trying to figure that out along with their leaders and their team and people maybe that they've never met before, right? So they're trying to build that trust in those relationships at the same time figuring out this new way of working. So in the last couple of minutes, I think it would be great if we could touch on maybe just some thoughts on what hiring leaders can do right now, how you all are thinking about next year and beyond, and maybe some of your predictions for what 2022 is going to look like. So Kirti, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I do think that for 2022, we are going to have to be open-minded to flexibility, because that's really what people are looking for, especially as marketers. Number two, I think we are going to have to think about creating meaningful human interactions. And what I mean by that is whether we do it virtually, whether we bring people together 2 or 3 times a year, I think human interaction is going to still matter. And so we're going to need to figure out the meaningful way to do that. And number 3, I think because of just like the constant movement, and I tend to be, you know, I think you picked up that I am a hardcore digital marketer. I think digital is just constantly moving stuff around, optimizing things, creating new tools and stuff. So I think it's going to be about like, how do we train? How do we, upskill or reskill folks? I do think the idea of a marketing generalist is going to go out the door. I felt like that a few years ago, frankly, where you can't come in and just say, I only do brand. Nope, that doesn't work. You're going to need to know brand with data, with digital, with all of that. And same thing for, other type of marketing functions that exist. I think there needs to be cross-pollinated intelligence, and that's going to definitely be a required trend moving forward.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of debate about generalists versus specialists, but I tend to lean on the side of the specialists as well. Great. So Jenna,
Yeah, the only other plug.
Extra special generalists is what they're going to have to be.
Yeah, the only other plug into that, I think, is I think for hiring leaders and organizations to be successful, at least in the short term, as we do have this supply gap, knowing what the skills are early and planning for that as early as possible, and giving those requisitions and skills to talent acquisition so they can build out a strategy early so that it's not so reactive all the time. A lot of organizations constantly are reactive to what their needs are, but really doing some true strategic workforce planning, especially now, is critical to be successful.
So Maggie, when I think about this, I think about, look, on-demand labor will continue its slow and steady growth, maybe at a slightly accelerated pace. We know remote work has exploded, going from 3% of the labor force to about 8%, but flexible work up towards 33%. And so as people are thinking about their workforce planning, you need to take into account all these different trends. You want to be an employer of choice in this regard, especially when there's an acute labor shortage, although that will pass, but you still want to win the war for talent by being an employer of choice. And I will tell you, the companies that I see do that are the companies that have a well-defined culture, that they have a culture document about who they are, why they're here, where they're going, what they stand for, and all the policies and procedures that back that up. And to Kirti's point, if that means turning your computer off at 12 o'clock on a Friday, that's what your culture is, great. But you have to really mean it, Because if you then have a boss sending an email at 3 o'clock, then you're like, well, this is all bullshit. So being authentic and being very clear and deliberate about what that culture is will help you build the glue that will keep your workforce together, regardless if it's on demand, regardless if it's remote, where you're working, how you're working. And as work continues to evolve, if you have a well-defined culture, you're going to be in a much better spot.
Yeah, absolutely love it. And so we're at the top of the hour here. As you guys can see, we could talk about this for hours and still not tackle all the topics. I just want to say a special thank you to our panelists for sharing your experience and your insights. A special thank you to Grace O'Hara on the Blend 360 team for her support in organizing and executing this. And, hopefully we can continue the dialogue. We appreciate everybody's participation. It has been recorded, and there'll be a really short survey so that we can continue to bring you valuable content. So thank you all, appreciate it. And hopefully we can have another session here in the next couple of months. Thank you.